the Institute for the Study of Pig States presents the second International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. Developing Psychoimmunology Treatments Using Trauma Epigenetics, presented by Dr. Grant McFetridge.
Well, none of this would be possible if it wasn't for our next speaker. So Dr. Grant McFetridge originally worked in electrical engineering R&D as a consultant and adjunct faculty in California. He then earned a PhD in psychology to look at why people get sick, applying his engineering mindset. In 1998, he founded the Institute for the Study of Pig States, where he still co-directs the research. He's the author of many books, including Subcellular Psychobiology, Diagnosis Handbook, Silence the Voices, Pig States of Consciousness, Volumes 1 and 2, and the Wholehearted Healing Manual. So over to you, Grant.
How do I make it work? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Can you see me?
We can.
Excellent. Now I got it. Is this working? Not yet. Sorry, guys. Zoom, I'm just not that familiar with. Okay. Can you guys see my slides?
Yeah, we can.
All right, excellent. Okay. So this, let's just, sorry. There we go. Well, this is a really exciting talk for me because we've been basically working on this problem for, God knows, 20 years. And we only started to make real substantial process in the last year. So it'll be a fun talk to show why it was so hard and kind of what we did to build up to it. I'm going to start by saying there's safety concerns here. So we're not saying everything because we don't want people to just run off and experiment on themselves. We'll be talking about some of the safety issues later on in the talk. But if you're interested in more detail on the biology and the work that we're doing, there's several books that you can get that describe this stuff. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge the volunteers that I've worked with for actually many years. They've poured tons of time and energy into working on this projects with the vague hope that something might work. And I tell you, research is frustrating. It's 99% failure, maybe 1% success. And you've got long periods where nothing works. So these are tough people. I also want to thank all the volunteers who've worked with us over the years, both as clients and contributed to the projects, even if just for a brief time. Okay, so let's start. What the heck is psychoimmunology? Well, I'm going to just back up a little bit and say that there's a lot of techniques that came out of the humanistic psychology movement back in the 70s. It's kind of like an explosion. And if you were in California, like I was at the time, you couldn't hardly walk down the street without seeing a new modality or theory or practice come up. The idea was that they could help people get more well by interacting the mind as psychology or spiritual practice and help your physical body. If you kind of visualize it over time, that explosion happened and now it's kind of settling out, and there's a few modalities that have moved into the mainstream. I mean, everybody uses chiropractors now. Acupuncture is completely normal. Yeah, there's just a ton of stuff. Okay. Now, during that period, there was a discussion about something that was called the placebo effect. Now, many people think that placebo effect is you think you're well, but it turns out that's not the case. People who take the sugar pills expecting they're going to get well actually get well. Doesn't work all the time, but it's surprisingly effective. And in fact, it's so effective that drug companies have a hard time. They have to prove that their drugs are more effective than placebo, which is typically around 30%. So here is an obvious connection between your emotions and your thoughts and your health, and no one understood what the heck was going on. So the field of psychoimmunology basically says that your feelings, your thoughts, and emotions affect your body, and particularly your immune system. And interestingly enough, the idea is the opposite's true. Your immune system can affect your feelings, thoughts, and emotions. Now, the mainstream medical and academia back in the 70s and 80s and so on basically separated the two, psychology and biology, completely. And it was the field of psychoimmunology that started to change that. Okay, so if we look at the timeline, this whole idea of psychoimmunology started in '62 with a paper by George Solomon. And then in '75, the first real key discovery was made by Adler and Cohen, where they demonstrated that they can condition the immune system of rabbits. Was it rats? I think it was rabbits, but rats or rabbits. It was hard on the the laboratory animals. And then in '85, Candace Pert made a fundamental breakthrough where she found neuropeptide receptors in the brain and in the immune system, which showed the signaling pathway between the two. In 1993, the Psychoneuroimmunology Research Society was founded. So if you just visualize it over time, it started to ramp up in the 80s. And the 90s, it was really exciting because now researchers were saying, we're at the edge of making a discovery on how to interact between psychology and on the mind and the immune system. Now, I'm speaking from my perspective at this point, but by 2010 or so, the whole field collapsed. And that was because, again, my opinion, because there were no progress in useful models and applications. So a lot of really interesting research was being done, but nothing in a kind of a practical level, treatment level was coming out of that. And people just started to move away from that whole field and start looking elsewhere for something that was working, exciting: stem cells, epigenetics, now vaccines. If you look at psychoimmunology, or the more recent label of psychoneuroimmunology studies, they're pretty much relegated to stress or inflammation, and how it affects the immune system. It's quite disappointing, actually. So now we started working on this problem a long time ago, back in the 90s, and we slowly followed a path that was quite different. Okay, so the first thing to do is to really stand back and say, what are the unconscious assumptions? And once you see that, then you can start to say, maybe I could approach this in a different way. So if you think of the medical model, it's kind of like a victim model. You've got your castle of your immune system, and there's these evil, nasty pathogens to try and storm the castle. And if you're having a bad day, they can knock the castle down, and then you have to fight them off. So I'm sure all of you could relate to this model, and in fact, the language even reflects it. Fight the disease and all that sort of stuff. What we decided to do is look at it in a different way. And again, this way of seeing it was quite different. It says, instead of being the victim, instead of having to have a castle to fight it off, what if we get disease because we want to get sick? In other words, we're self-sabotaging and getting the illness because we want the illness. Okay? So the old model, our model. Well, shit, if that's true, can I say that? If that's true, does that make sense? So just look how this works. If you look at the victim model, you've got that you have to stay well, stay healthy. You have to keep your immune system all peaked up. You have to pay your little soldiers lots of money. I mean, basically, that's the approach that most people take. But if the self-sabotage model is correct, boy, there's some really interesting implications. First of all, it says that our bodies are way more powerful than we ever imagined. And it also means that our bodies are way stupider than we ever imagined. I mean, after all, why would want to do this? But the other implications that if this is true, we could actually convince the body not to want a pathogen and not only get well, but get immune. Okay. The other thing is, if this is true, it would neatly explain the placebo effect. Okay. So to prove something, you have to have both a theory and a model, and you have to have a technique that can demonstrate it. So first, we had to figure out why we would want to self-sabotage. Why would we want a pathogen? I mean, they make us sick. They make us feel ill. They can kill us. They can do terrible things to our body. So why is that? The other thing we'd have to do is, to prove that this was a valid technique, is we'd have to figure out some way to eliminate that need to self-sabotage to see if the pathogen and the symptoms vanish. Okay. So again, why would we be so stupid as to want a pathogen? So to figure that out took a lot of years, and we needed to have a little background to explain this. Okay. So as Shane was saying earlier, we made a bunch of different discoveries over the years as we slowly worked our way up towards the solution. One was the primary cell. We found that there was one particular cell that kind of like set the pattern for the rest of the body, and that was the cell where consciousness itself resided. That alone is a radical departure from conventional thinking. But it turns out that once you've made this discovery, then you can realize that modifications in the primary cell actually echo out into the entire body. Okay, so now it sort of says if this PI model works and we interact with the primary cell, then maybe we can make all the cells well. Okay, then another breakthrough that we needed was trauma, and not only just trauma healing, but we needed to be able to access prenatal events to heal them, because it turned out prenatal events, particularly key developmental moments like conception or implantation or ovulation or whatever, were where the biological organism gets far more complicated, and it turns out that's where vulnerabilities are for these problems of the pathogens. Okay. We also needed to be able to fix epigenetic damage. Now, basically that says we need to be able to make the genes do what they're supposed to do. And it turned out that trauma healing does interact with epigenetics. And we had to be, the tricky bit was figuring out how do you target a particular gene that's relevant to what you want to think, that you want to heal. Okay, and finally, we realized there are different kinds of trauma, and again, they depend on the biology of the cell. Turns out there's biographical trauma, generational trauma, and body association traumas, kind of like Pavlov's dog. Celine in the last talk spoke about those. Okay, so now we have trauma healing tools. We have insights in how they affect the interior of the cell, and we've done enough experimenting that we know that we can repair things in the cell, but that doesn't solve PI yet, psychoimmunology. Okay, so just a quick visual. Sometimes it's helpful to see what I'm talking about as far as epigenetics. If you look inside the cell itself, the nucleus expresses a gene. It comes up towards the surface of the nucleus. An mRNA copy is made, and then it's released out the nuclear pore. Unfortunately, with trauma, that mRNA string gets stuck, and the ribosomes that are supposed to make proteins just start ramping up like a pile of strings down a chain. But it turns out that with the good trauma healing techniques, you can free up the stuck gene, release the mRNA string, get rid of all the ribosomes, and it's experienced as getting rid of trauma. Okay, so you get 2 for at the price of 1. Okay. So I'm going rather fast through this. It's all in my books and stuff because I want to get to the good stuff, and it's already 10 minutes after. Okay. So again, prenatal developmental biology. So it turns out that because of our work with prenatal trauma and developmental events, we could actually figure out how to target trauma healing to the places in development where the genes that we needed to fool with were. So let me put that in another way. Say you know that you need certain genes to be turned on. How are you going to find them? There's thousands of these suckers, so or at least hundreds, and you can't just randomly heal stuff because you'd be old before you're done. So we figured out that if at developmental moments we could actually trigger people into going back to those developmental moments, and then with some tricks, and then once they were there, we had some easy ways to heal things. So now we had a way to target genes and the genes that mattered at developmental events, but we still couldn't figure out the PI problem. PI being psychoimmunology. Okay, I should make one mention on vaccines. If it turns out that we want the pathogens and that we let them in, our little Trojan horses, how do vaccines work? We are not actually getting rid of the desire for the pathogen with the vaccine, but we think what's going on is that there's body systems that compete. One says, I want this disease, another says, this is making symptoms, and so we need to get rid of it. We're not actually sure about that, how that works, but I thought some of you who were pretty thinking about the implications might have noticed that, so I wanted to mention it. Okay, so this gets us up to about 2010, and we'd already demonstrated that we could do psychoimmunology on a particular fungus that created schizophrenic voices. But aside from that real success, we were not getting good results in general, and we weren't actually sure why. Okay, so now let's talk about the core of this project. How did we crack the psychoimmunology problem? So there's several ways to do this, and I could do it like a textbook, which we're writing, but it's pretty boring. So instead, I'm just going to give you a story like it was a detective story as we slowly work this stuff out. So please bear with me. Okay. So I'm just going to go through some of the observations. Now, I've already filtered out all the hundreds of observations that turned out to not be relevant. So you're just getting the good stuff. Okay. So in 2017, we started to work on PI more seriously. I've been working on and off for nearly 20 years, but that's where my attention really started to shift. And it's just on a personal note, it's really interesting how our psyche kind of aligns the environment with what we're thinking. I started rewriting our websites, and I realized after about a month of doing that what I was really doing was starting to set myself up to work on psychoimmunology. Okay, so we had some puzzling observations that on immunity that we didn't know quite how they fit into this whole idea of psychoimmunology. And one was Lyme's disease. I was really fortunate that I ran across a guy who could regress and see in his body really, really well. And he had Lyme's, or he'd had Lyme's, and he'd gone through antibiotics, and he still, I think, had some vestigial symptoms. And that was enough for us to do a regression to see what the heck happened. And he was actually able to go back to when the ticks attacked him. And what he observed was very, very interesting. The ticks bit, and they injected the spirochetes, the Lyme spirochetes, into his body. Well, that we expected. What we didn't expect is that he observed that the spirochetes were giving off a black fluid into his body that was affecting him. And he was able to sense it or feel it enough so that he then was able to regress back in time and say, you know, I felt this sensation before. And it it put them back to very early development, where a different pathogen was releasing a similar black fluid that felt the same. And we went, well, perhaps if we heal trauma at this moment in development where this other fluid is, not the Lymes one, but a similar one, maybe we can heal that and it'll affect the Lymes. And sure enough, we tried that and it worked. Well, he was quite excited. He thought, okay, maybe we've really cracked the idea of how to do Lyme's disease. And I was hopeful, but I was also thinking, okay, how come some people have Lyme's and they take a few antibiotics and they get well, other people have it and they don't get well no matter what. So I was pretty sure that there was some other factor going on with Lyme's that we didn't understand. But still, it was really interesting. So the next observation was chronic fatigue in the fall of 2017. My colleague, John, had a chronic fatigue client, and he had a suspicion that Lyme's was giving the client the chronic fatigue experience. And so he focused on this fluid, and he did some body association, some trauma healing. Basically, he threw the kitchen sink at it and got rid of the fatigue in the client. And I should add that the client hasn't had fatigue since. So what happened? Why did this work? What were we doing? Okay, so this is sort of setting this adventure story up. We've got some data points, but we don't really understand the underlying biology. Okay. Now this one's fascinating. My partner and colleague, Dr. Lyckegaard, was working with a client who had shingles, a very painful shingles on her shoulder. And if you've ever had shingles, I understand it's absolutely excruciating. Anyway, they were able to identify some emotional tones in the area of the shingles, and they did a couple of body associations, and poof, the pain was gone. I mean, literally, we're talking a couple of minutes, and as far as we know, the pain didn't come back. So what the heck happened? How come these emotional tones were embedded in the shingle zone, and why did a body association get rid of the symptoms? Okay, so now you can see stuff is starting to float around in space. There's these facts, but how does it all tie together? Okay, so this brings us up to about the fall of 2019. And I got a very fast growing skin cancer on my cheek. And I thought to myself, okay, this is a really good opportunity to look at the psychoimmunology problem. How come this exists? And I had the disease for a couple of months, and I had the entire research staff helping me work on this problem. What's going on with this disease? What's going on? And what we found was really interesting. Now, you don't have to agree. I'm just going to tell you the story of what we discovered. It may turn out in the future, we'll find out actually the circumstances are different, but this is what we got at the time. What we found was a skin mite had gotten in through a shaving cut and was injecting an amoebic disease or pathogens into my skin as part of its, I guess, as part of its eating procedure. And those amoebas in turn carried prions and viruses. And that appeared to be what set off my skin cell carcinoma. Okay, so what I found particularly weird about this experience was as you know, I had a lot of ability to look in my own body, but when I looked into the cancer, all I saw was air. It was like there was a little bubble of air in my cheek instead of a cancer. And what the heck was happening? Well, it was my colleague Lars Vestby who actually cracked the problem. And he cracked it the day before I went into surgery. He realized that the amoeba was releasing a fluid that was very similar to a fluid released by the newly implanting zygote. And that tells the mother, the zygote tells the mother, hey, I'm supposed to be here. Don't send your immune system at me. Everything's fine. Well, this amoeba was emitting a fluid that also sent the same signal to my body. And literally, it was a real surprise why that area seemed just like air, even though I could touch it and I could feel quite a lump. Okay, so now this was a fundamental breakthrough, because now we started to see the significance of the pathogens, the pathogen fluids, and developmental events. See how those three things start to tie together? Okay. So I'm just going to skip through the next slide, but this is me during surgery. There we go. That was fast. Was it too fast? No, it was okay. Okay. It was a hell of a lump. I mean, a big chunk of my cheek was removed. Okay. So all this was well and good, and I was recovering from the surgery, and I was thinking, okay, in the fall of 2020, we'll start to work on PI now that we've had some things, but we'll continue on current projects and stuff and see how it goes. Then COVID hit, and we got lucky. One of our staff physicians got COVID, and he'd been trained. He knew how to use the techniques, and suddenly we had a wonderful guinea pig to experiment on. And to make a long story short, we discovered that stuff that we just still to this day find quite hard to believe. We found that the COVID was actually carried by an amoeba. One style that was airborne, and another style that moved by touch. And so there were actually 3 pathogens involved in this disease. And that the next thing we discovered was that these pathogens all emitted fluids. And the breakthrough for us was to realize that these pathogen fluids from the amoebas and the virus were, again, very similar to fluids at key moments in development. So I want to say more on this. I'd mentioned the fluid that was appearing at implantation, but it turned out something that we hadn't even known was that there were these little micro events where fluid was produced either by the parent or by oneself to trigger a biological change. And there was a lot of these micro events, fluid micro events. And now we're starting to tie the pathogen fluids back to development, but through these microfluid events. Okay, so just to repeat it again, pathogen makes a fluid. Back in your early development, there is a fluid that you're supposed to use and have. And this fluid the pathogen making is similar. So I think you're starting to see what's going on here. The body wants that fluid that the pathogen make because it reminds it of the fluid from early development. Okay. Still stupid, right? The body shouldn't be doing this, but there's something going on here that we could start to look at. Okay. What we also discovered with these pathogen fluids, each one had a particular negative emotional tone in it. So you could actually identify these pathogen fluids by an emotion. And what we found was really interesting. The emotional tone of the fluid, was coupled through a body association to the need to keep it. And this is a result of this early developmental event. So it turns out that if you could target the right emotional tone, you could do a body association, again, like Pavlov's dog, heal it up, and your need for that fluid would vanish. Okay. And what was really interesting, once the need for that fluid vanished, what we found was the fluid itself would poof away. because the body would look at it and go, huh, what's that doing here? Oh no, that's not supposed to be here. And it would clean it right up. We'd seen this before, but it really struck home the idea that the body is far more powerful than we give it credit for. Because you heal these few things and poof, the fluid gets gone. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this went on, and we eventually, I'm almost out of time here, so I better go a little quicker. We eventually figured that toxic fluids wasn't enough to get rid of the pathogen. Although we could get rid of the toxic fluids, we couldn't do the pathogen. And we soon realized that it was the membrane of the pathogen that was the key here. The membrane of the pathogen itself reminded the body of a developmental fluid. And once we realized that, we could target that particular developmental fluid, and the body would go, huh, this pathogen is like this fluid, but it shouldn't be there once we'd healed this event. And that turned out to be the breakthrough. That really worked. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I guess I'll mention that I'm talking about coronavirus on Sunday. It turned out more complex than what I've described here so far. But you basically got the breakthrough in the psychoimmunology approach that we're using now. Okay, so how well does this work? Now we've only developed, I don't know, 4 or 5 different processes using this approach so far. Again, this is all new to us, but it usually takes about 1 to 2 hours to get rid of the symptoms that a person has. And with some developments recently, we think we can speed that up to maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, last thing I should mention, because all this is experimental, we have a pay for results policy on everything we do. So if it doesn't work, it's free. Okay. The other thing is problems of safety. This approach is like anything. We're interacting with the inside of cells, and there are some safety issues that have to be addressed. One is trauma healing itself. There's problems with trauma healing, as trauma therapists all know. If you go in for trauma therapy, usually you have a disclaimer and form that explains all that stuff. The other problem actually is in the developmental events. And again, these pathogen fluids, these pathogen membranes, they echo back into a very early micro event where there's a good fluid being made. Things can go really wrong in these events. And before you just randomly run off and say, oh, I can fix this, you need to look at those events to see something doesn't get triggered in the client when you start to access those moments. Okay, I've got some examples on safety. I just go on that. Safety testing, of course, we have the research, but then we take a lot of effort to test for safety. And we test on healthy volunteers. It's very much like doing drug research. You test on well people, and then you work with clients. And so there's a whole long and tedious process we go through to make sure this stuff is actually safe. It can take years sometimes. Okay, final couple of slides. What I've described to you is a really disruptive technology. What it means is that we can do stuff that's never been done before, and we can do it without the problems of drugs and drug side effects and all that stuff. It doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% effective to everyone. People are complex. Some people can't heal trauma well, but it's very exciting, and it can address diseases that we haven't solved before. So you're basically watching me speak at a time when we're really starting to make progress in the whole field of psychoimmunology, and it's really exciting for me and our colleagues. I mean, the bad news is it's also a new technology. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Okay, so in summary, trauma techniques work by healing epigenetic damage. There's a self-sabotage model of infection that's fundamentally different than the unconscious assumption in the academic and professional environment. We can actually find out why a body wants a pathogen because it's determined in early development, and there's potential safety issues that exist that have to be addressed, that can't be ignored. Okay, we have a bunch of textbooks, as Shane had mentioned earlier. They're can be very slow going, but they're quite in depth. And I think I have 1 minute left for questions. Shane, how am I doing? Am I past?
We planned for the fact that you've got so much content you wanted to get across that we could run a few minutes over. At the moment, there's only one question.
Okay.
So are there body associations that are beneficial? So in other words, is it possible to mess things up by healing a body association when in fact the body really needed to have that?
I like the questioner's attitude because that's the safety issue that we have to address. These sorts of things. Are we going to make it worse or are we making it better? The good news is we've been doing body associations for nearly 20 years and we haven't seen any negative problems with it. Yeah, thousands and thousands of them in lots and lots of people. So that one looks like a pretty safe technique. Okay, any more questions?
Not at the moment. There was one in the, okay, we've got another one. So this is from Gulzada. What do you think about progressive progression to the future to heal problems?
I'm not sure I understand.
We've talked about regressing to heal past traumas. Given that would suggest that maybe the future traumas are actually also on that trauma string. So what do you think about doing a regression into the future rather than into the past to heal traumas?
Well, I think you could probably change your future by healing trauma in the past. In other words, basically trauma sets you up for failure in your life. And so, yes, you're going to the past to fix it, but it does change your future in a positive way. Good. Well, thank you for everyone for listening. And this is very exciting for me because not only is it the accumulation of 30 years of work or getting close to the end point in my work, but it's exciting. And you're actually joining us right at the time that we're making huge progress by leaps and bounds. I think Shane can say he's really feeling fortunate that, Shane, how do you feel about being involved right now?
Yes, I definitely timed it correctly. That 12 years ago, there was lots of exciting stuff, but it was, I think, obvious to the core team there that there was still lots more that had to be done, but now's a great time to be involved. There's so much potential.
Yeah, I feel the same. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Shane?
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Grant.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching. For more information, visit pigstates.com/psychoimmunology.html.